Hello, you're listening to Storytelling Saga, the podcast that shares stories. I'm your host, Allie, and this week I'm discussing Pixar's 22 Rules of Storytelling. These rules were shared by a Pixar storyboard artist named Emma Coates. She shared them back in 2012 when she was working at Pixar. She also wrote and directed a few of her own short films, and she currently works at Google. But I stumbled across these rules, I want to say back in 2013, and they're great screenwriting tips, but they're really just great tips for writing a story in general. And so let's go ahead and go through her rules. Number 1, she says, you admire a character for trying more than for their successes. And that's true really for all of us as humans, that we learn more about ourselves, more so when we fail than when we succeed. And also, when it translates on screen, when you see a character fail, it is, of course, discouraging, but it makes it all the more satisfying by the end when the character does achieve their goals, and that it feels earned. It doesn't feel that they didn't stumble and fall along the way, that is part of achieving any goal. And so that's applicable not only to movies, but just life in general. Number 2, she says, you got to keep in mind what's interesting to you as an audience, not what's fun to do as a writer. That can be very different. So looking at the very first Pixar film, Toy Story, it's just a great movie told from the point of view of toys and that amazing concept of when you leave the room, your toys come alive. And so, of course, that's interesting to especially to kids, because when you play, you use your imagination and the kids bring the toys to life. But then when the humans leave, the toys themselves come to life. And it's just so enjoyable. And those characters, of course, are so beloved and they connect with the audience. Number 3, trying for theme is important, but you won't see what the story is actually about till you're at the end of it. Now rewrite. And first off, I have to say, as difficult as it is to write, it's so much more difficult to rewrite, because it's basically when you write a first draft of anything, or even just writing the outline and you're finding the story, when you go to write it for the first time, it's just a matter of getting it done, getting each scene written, getting the story complete to the resolution. But the difficult part is when you're going back to rewrite, is basically taking things apart, seeing what works and what doesn't, and it's basically fitting everything together like a puzzle. It's challenging, but then it's so much more rewarding when you get that final draft and, of course, getting it made and getting it out there. And these movies are so beloved because there's so much heart put into them, these Pixar films. And they're loved not only by kids, but, of course, people of all ages. Number 4, this is all about structure. Once upon a time, there was blank. Every day, blank. One day, blank. Because of that, blank. Because of that, blank. Until finally, blank. So let's look at, for instance, Monsters, Inc. and just piece that together using this screenwriting structure when constructing a plot for a movie. Once upon a time, there were these monsters living in their monster society. And we meet Mike Wazowski and James P. Sullivan, who work at Monsters, Inc. Every day they go to work here, and we see what they do for a living, that they go into kids' rooms and scare them. And when the kids scream, that is used as fuel for this monster society. One day, one of the kids gets out, the little girl Boo, as they call her, but her name is in fact Mary, her real name, but they call her Boo. That's what Sully names her. And because of that, because she got out, it causes chaos for this monster world. Because when she cries, it overpowers the electricity. Or when she laughs, it just full on blows out the electricity. So it affects their world. Because of that, she needs to be put back into her room and they need to destroy the door, sadly. And it's so sad for Sully because he develops a bond with this little girl. And that this little girl isn't afraid of him. And he grows to really form a nice, heartwarming friendship with her. And so when the room is destroyed, the door is destroyed, it's so sad for Sully. Until finally, by the end, the monsters learn that, in fact, laughter is a better power source for them than screams ever were, than terrifying these kids. And so they changed Monsters, Inc. to, instead of scaring them, they go in and make them laugh. And Mike Wazowski is great at that. And then by the end, he pieces together the door for Sully. And such a heartwarming moment when Sully lifts the piece of paper with the drawing that Boo had drawn of the two of them. He has the one last piece of the door. He puts it in, the light goes on. He walks in, and he reunites with Boo. So that's a structure applied to really any screenplay in any film. It's what disrupts the status quo that basically jumpstarts the action of the movie. Another term for that really is the inciting incident. So the moment that everything changes essentially for the protagonist and how they deal with it, how they learn to overcome it, what they learn about themselves along the way. Number 5, simplify, focus, combine characters, hop over detours. You'll feel like you're losing valuable stuff, but it sets you free. So let's look at now Inside Out, another great Pixar film. The writers and producers, they had looked at a total of 21 different emotions they were considering before they finally narrowed it down to the main 5 of joy, sadness, anger, disgust, and fear. But other emotions they considered were surprise, hope, love, and embarrassment. And there were others. But basically, what I interpret from this is just you need to get rid of anything that isn't an essential part in the story. Because when you have all these extra details, it will just not really bring anything to the story. It will just basically weigh it down and make it not as enjoyable to watch in the sense, because then you won't care as much about the characters because it won't be as meaningful. So it's important to just really narrow it down. So in Inside Out, again, when they just really focused the attention on joy and sadness in particular, and joy having to learn about sadness's true purpose for their kid Riley, who they're the ones who are Riley's emotions. And so the protagonist really, though, is joy, her coming to understand and appreciate sadness and its purpose in Riley, and thus in human development in general, that we need to experience sadness sometimes in order to feel joy. That's part of growing up, that's part of being a human. Number 6, she says, what is your character good at, comfortable with? Throw the polar opposite at them. Challenge them. How do they deal? So for this one, let's look at The Incredibles with our main character, Bob Parr, who of course really is Mr. Incredible. And he was this great superhero in his time, but then when superheroes are banned, they have to suppress their superpowers, him and his family, because they each have their own distinct superpower. And so he misses his glory days of being a superhero. And so he has to learn that he can't live in the past, and also he needs to trust his family, know that they all have their own unique things that make them great, that as a family they truly are, literally, they're incredible. Number 7, come up with your ending before you figure out your middle. Seriously, endings are hard. Get yours working up front. So let's look at now Ratatouille, where the ending is the main character, Remy, gets to fulfill his lifelong dream working at a restaurant and cooking food for people because that's what he loves. He loves food. But he felt he was at a disadvantage, of course, because he's a rat, and he just sees that, well, we're rats, we eat garbage, we're not meant to live among humans, let alone cook food. But then he forms a partnership with Alfredo Linguini, what a name, the kind of clumsy kid who's trying to be a chef but isn't good at it, but then Remy controls him by pulling his hair. So the two of them together, they make a great team. And it's a nice blend where Remy gets to do what he loves. He gets to have this restaurant, and it works out great for both the human world and Remy and his fellow rats. Number 8, finish your story. Let go even if it's not perfect. In an ideal world, you have both, but move on. Do better next time. So with this rule, I couldn't help but think of a certain quote I heard. I may have first heard it back in college. One of my professors had said. It may have been my playwriting professor, actually. I can't recall off the top of my head. But basically, the sentiment was, art is never finished. It's merely abandoned. Especially when you rewrite and rewrite and rewrite, eventually you have to get the work out there, especially when you have a deadline. whether it is writing a screenplay or, say, writing a book, writing an episode of television. You only have a certain amount of time. You need to get it out there, get it filmed so it can go on the air, and then you move on to the next one, whether next episode or just next project you're working on. And of course, then when you go back and watch it or go back and read it if you wrote a book, you may think to yourself, oh, I wish I had written this differently. But of course, that's how anyone's going to feel. It's just a matter of, while it's out there, you learn from it, you change your style along the way when you go to your next project, and that you'll never be 100% satisfied. It's just how it is, but it's just a matter of you just go on to the next project and don't harp so much on the little things. Number 9, she says, when you're stuck, make a list of what wouldn't happen next. Lots of times the material to get you unstuck will show up. And it's just a great piece of advice that when you're stuck on a scene or where to take the story next, particularly when you're breaking the story, you can say, put your characters in a scenario you know would not happen in this world that you've created. And then when you do that, you could perhaps think of something that will work and maybe necessarily didn't even think of before. So that's just a great tip for writer's block specifically, helping you really hone down the story. For number 10, she says, pull apart the stories you like. What you like in them is a part of you. You've got to recognize it before you can use it. And so that draws back to what my TV writing instructor has always told us, Jerry Persigian. He said, personal is universal. So looking at Toy Story 3 specifically, the theme of growing up, and of course that incredibly touching scene by the end of the movie when Andy gives his toys away to that little girl, Bonnie, and he's going away to college. And Woody just says, so long, partner. And it's so touching and sweet. And as sad as it is to say goodbye to that chapter of his life, he'll always have the memories. And he knows that Andy's going to grow up and be an amazing person. And even though Andy's not a kid anymore, his intent is that Woody's a toy, and all of them, they're toys. They want to be played with. They can't just be sitting on shelves or up in the attic. It's meant to be passed down to the next generation. So you got this sweet little girl, Bonnie, who will take care of these toys and show them love and play with them the way Andy used to. And so that's something we can all relate to growing up. When you're not a kid anymore, you obviously grow out of things, you get new interests, but it's still nice to hold on to the childhood memories that you can always look fondly back on. Number 11, she says, putting it on paper lets you start fixing it. If it stays in your head, a perfect idea, you'll never share it with anyone. So that's just a matter of getting the story written, getting that first draft written at least, or getting an outline done, coming up with a plot or fleshing out your characters. Just get it done and get it started, because you never know what this project you're working on can turn into. Number 12, she says, discount the first thing that comes to mind. And the second, third, fourth, fifth. Get the obvious out of the way. Surprise yourself. So that's just a matter of, although you may think the first idea you have is great, keep pushing yourself to really see what other ideas you can come up with, and you will, as she said, you will then surprise yourself. And when you do that as a writer, it will then, of course, surprise the audience. Number 13, she says, give your characters opinions. Passive or malleable might seem likable to you as you write, but it's poison to the audience. So looking at, for instance, in the movie Up, where you have Russell, the super happy scout, and then you have, of course, Carl Fredricksen, the grumpy old man, and the reason he seems so angry and stubborn is really because he's grieving the loss of his wife, Ellie. And so those are polar opposite personalities, but they work well together as foils. In any film or any work of fiction, any form of storytelling, those odd couple type pairings are just great for conflict and therefore in stories. Number 14, she says, why must you tell this story? What's the belief burning within you that your story feeds off of? That's the heart of it. So again, it goes back to, what do you find meaningful? Because whatever you find meaningful, it will then be authentic in the characters, and that will be felt by the audience. Looking at, for instance, Finding Nemo, where Marlin, after sadly his wife and nearly all of their little eggs are killed, there's only one left, and it ends up being who he names Nemo. And when Nemo ends up getting captured in the movie, and then of course Marlon has to go find him. It's just that terrifying feeling of being separated, parent and child being separated and wanting to be reunited. Number 15, if you were your character in this situation, how would you feel? Honesty lends credibility to unbelievable situations. So let's look at that other heartbreaking scene in Toy Story 3 when the toys are in that, the scene, when they're in the incinerator thinking that that's the end for them, and they just are all absolutely terrified, but then they just all join hands. That feeling of, well, it's the end, but we're all together. And it's so heartbreaking, but it's so powerful. Number 16, she says, what are the stakes? Give us a reason to root for the character. What happens if they don't succeed? Stack the odds against them. So let's look at now another great Pixar movie, of course, WALL-E. That movie, first off, is great because the first third of it or so, the first act, I guess, it has no dialogue. It's mostly just showing you this new age form of Earth in which it has become uninhabitable, and it's just WALL-E, the little robot, having to clean the Earth. And it's so touching because he wants companionship, and then he meets the other robot, Eve, and they fall in love. But it's sweet. But the stakes in that one are high because the humans are in a new world and they're all unhealthy. And they basically have to learn how to restore Earth and save the environment so they can live there again. Number 17, she says, no work is ever wasted. If it's not working, let go and move on. It'll come back around to be useful later. So if a scene isn't working, for example, don't dwell on it. Go ahead and move on to a different part of the story, just a new scene, and come back to it later. Maybe focus on a different character and see where that goes. Or a different relationship and see what happens there. Number 18, she says, you have to know yourself. The difference between doing your best and fussing. Story is testing, not refining. So again, that's part of the writing process, finding the story and the steps along the way. And it's not going to be perfect the first time you write it, but when you rewrite it and you get notes and feedback and you think about it more and see new places you can take the characters or the story itself, it's about basically testing the waters, see what works, what doesn't. And when you do that, you will be able to tell a more compelling story. Because, for instance, for Toy Story, a behind-the-scenes fact about that, when the writers first wrote the story, they were told by executives, I guess, that Woody was a very unlikable character, that he was basically came off as this sarcastic jerk. So they had to go back to the drawing board, basically, and rewrite it and get to the core of, well, why was Woody acting this way? And it's because he felt threatened that Buzz was going to come in and take everything that was important to him, namely Andy. And so then, of course, now Woody's my favorite character in Toy Story. He's very likable. He's a great leader. He's the toy that all the other toys look up to. And he forms a true friendship with Buzz. So it just goes to show that you have to find what's working and what isn't and how you can make it better and make it something that audiences will enjoy. Number 19, she says, coincidences to get characters into trouble are great. Coincidences to get them out of it are cheating. So I want to go back to, again, Inside Out. Because there's actually a bit of a plot hole in that movie. And that is with the concept of recall. And it's a clever concept where there are these workers and they're sifting through the memories. And they can have Riley recall a memory at any time. And so there's just a funny gag where they're laughing. They're like, oh, let's just make her think of this again. They throw it into the recall and it shoots up into headquarters. And we see that it's just a little silly commercial jingle. But there's a plot hole because this was something they had thought of in later revisions. And in the movie, Joy, she has all of Riley's core memories that make up her personality. And it's clever in this world where she has these personality islands that make up who she is as a person. And with all those memories gone, Riley isn't her true self. And so it was this thing where you ask yourself, well, couldn't Joy just have used the recall feature to have the memories go back into headquarters so Riley could remember all of those core memories? But it works that it was basically Joy in her innovation getting her in Sadness back up to headquarters so they could help Riley. here we go, the last few. For number 20, she says, exercise. Take the building blocks of a movie you dislike. How do you rearrange them into what you do like? So, going back to scripts that are already out here in the world, and maybe there's something problematic about them, whether it's the characters or just the resolution, drawing inspiration from that, how you yourself would want to change it. Use that as a springboard. Number 21, she says, you gotta identify with your situation and characters. You can't just write quote-unquote cool. What would make you act that way? So, again, Toy Story, that entire trilogy about growing up and learning to move on, but knowing that you'll always have the friendship and the memories. And it's just creative and inventive the way they tell these stories. And putting yourself in the character's shoes and how you would react in these situations that the characters find themselves in. That's what makes them so great, the true, powerful emotions within them that the characters experience and that we, the audience, experience. And so her final rule is, what's the essence of your story? Most economical way of telling it? If you know that, you can build out from there. So with Pixar, since these films are animated, it just opens everything up to, well, we can write stories about toys and monsters and robots and flying houses and talking fish because it's animation and it's creative and kids love it, of course, but people of all ages love these movies. The themes of finding your true strength, of growing up, of true friendship, of working together, helping others, of learning how to overcome your insecurities, of learning how to be creative and innovative. And that's what makes them so beloved and cherished by audiences around the world. So thank you, Emma Coates, for sharing these tips. These are, as I said, great screenwriting tips, but also just great tips for writing stories in general. And with that, that's going to conclude this week's episode of Storytelling Saga. You can follow the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at Storytelling Saga, as well as on Twitter at Storytell Saga. You can also send me any questions, comments, or writing prompts by leaving me a message in the contact section of storytellingsaga.com or by sending me an email at storytellingsaga@gmail.com. Next week, I'm excited to welcome another guest on the show. I will be interviewing Stacy Grant. Stacy is a Snapchat editor at 17. She's also the author of the book Hey Arnold's Guide to Relationships. So I'm super excited to talk to her and learn about her career and just talk all things Nickelodeon nostalgia. It's going to be a lot of fun. Until then, thank you for listening, and remember, write what you love.